For months, he'd called it a hoax, a distraction, a Democrat conspiracy to smear him with the dead man's lies. He'd pressured Republicans to remove their names from the discharge petition. He'd held meetings in the Situation Room trying to stop the vote from happening. He'd made it clear without quite saying it that releasing the Epstein files would be a betrayal he wouldn't forget. Then the emails dropped on Wednesday, 20,000 pages with his name appearing over 1,000 times, and by Sunday night, Trump had reversed course so completely it gave everyone whiplash. House Republicans should vote to release the Epstein files he posted on Truth Social because we have nothing to hide. Monday morning, he told reporters it was really a Democrat problem and he'd sign the bill if it reached his desk. Just like that, the fight was over. The pressure campaign had ended, and the president who'd spent months blocking the files now wanted them released immediately, and nobody quite knew whether to believe him or whether this was just another move in a game where the rules changed every time you thought you understood them. Congressman David Holloway learned about the reversal the same way everyone else did, scrolling through his phone at 7 a.m. on Monday, coffee still brewing in the kitchen, and seeing the Truth Social post that made him read it 3 times before he believed it was real. He'd spent the last 72 hours fielding angry calls from constituents who wanted to know why he'd signed the discharge petition, why he'd sided with Democrats on forcing the Epstein files into the open, why he couldn't just trust the president when he said there was nothing to see. Holloway had listened to each call with the patience that came from 20 years in politics, explained his position carefully, and tried not to think about the Situation Room meeting on Wednesday afternoon, where he'd sat across from the president and been asked politely but firmly to reconsider his stance. Now, the president was saying exactly what Holloway had been saying all along, and somehow that felt worse than the pressure campaign had felt because it meant one of two things, and neither option was comforting. Either Trump had never actually cared about blocking the files and was just testing loyalty for sport, or something in those 20,000 pages that dropped on Wednesday had scared him badly enough that pretending to want transparency was less dangerous than continuing to fight it. Holloway wasn't sure which possibility bothered him more. His phone buzzed with a text from his chief of staff. "Did you see? What do we do?" Holloway stared at the message, trying to formulate a response that made sense when nothing about the situation made sense. He'd co-sponsored the bill to compel the Justice Department to release all unclassified files related to Jeffrey Epstein, the dead financier who'd counted presidents and princes among his friends before going to prison on charges that barely scratched the surface of what everyone suspected he'd done. Holloway had signed on to that bill because his district had made it clear they wanted answers, because transparency mattered more than political convenience, and because he'd looked at his teenage daughter one morning and realized he couldn't explain why powerful men got to keep their secrets while everyone else had to live with consequences. That decision had cost him. The president had pulled his endorsement 2 weeks ago, called him disloyal on social media, suggested that maybe his district deserved someone who understood what party unity meant. Conservative talk radio had torn into him, accused him of being a rhino and a traitor and worse things that he tried not to think about when he was trying to sleep. His colleagues had avoided him in the halls, not wanting to catch whatever disease he'd apparently contracted by thinking the Epstein case mattered more than keeping the president happy. And through all of it, Holloway had held the line because he'd made a choice and he was going to live with it, even if living with it meant losing his seat in the next primary. Now the president was on his side, or pretending to be, and Holloway felt more alone than he had when everyone was against him. The story of how they'd gotten here was messier than any headline could capture. The discharge petition had been gathering signatures since September, a bipartisan effort led by Thomas Massie from Kentucky and Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia on the Republican side, Ro Khanna from California for the Democrats. They needed 218 signatures to force a House floor vote, and by early November they'd had 217. Just one more signature, one more member willing to sign their name to the idea that maybe, possibly, the American people deserved to know what federal investigators had learned about a man who trafficked girls to powerful men for years. But getting that 218th signature had proven impossible because the Speaker kept the House out of session. Mike Johnson had closed the chamber in mid-September, ostensibly as a negotiating tactic during the shutdown fight with Democrats, but everyone knew the real reason. As long as the House wasn't meeting, newly elected Representative Adelita Grijalva from Arizona couldn't be sworn in, and as long as she wasn't sworn in, she couldn't sign the petition. And as long as the petition sat at 217 signatures, Johnson didn't have to schedule a vote. He clearly didn't want it to happen. The whole thing had been transparent political maneuvering, the kind of procedural gamesmanship that made voters cynical about Washington, but had worked right up until it didn't. The shutdown had ended last week. The House had reconvened, and Wednesday afternoon, Grijalva had finally taken the oath of office she'd been waiting 7 weeks to take. Her signature went on the discharge petition within an hour. By that evening, the petition had the numbers it needed, and Johnson, reading the room and realizing he'd lost this fight, announced the vote would happen next week. That should have been the end of it. A vote scheduled, a timeline set, transparency winning over obstruction, except Wednesday had also been the day the emails dropped, and those emails had changed everything. Holloway had been in his office when his phone started buzzing with alerts, notifications piling up faster than he could read them. Democrats on the House Oversight Committee had released 3 emails from Jeffrey Epstein's estate, correspondence that mentioned Trump's name and suggested, though the language was careful and the context unclear, that the president might have known more about Epstein's activities than he'd ever admitted. The most damning line came from a 2019 email where Epstein wrote, "Of course he knew about the girls," as he asked Ghislaine to stop. The White House had responded within an hour, calling it a hoax and a selective leak designed to generate clickbait. Republicans on the Oversight Committee had countered by releasing the full tranche of documents they received from the estate, more than 20,000 pages of emails, financial records, court filings, and personal correspondence. It was meant to provide context to show that cherry-picking 3 emails created a false narrative. But anyone who'd spent the afternoon reading through those documents, and Holloway had canceling meetings and ordering dinner to his office because once he started he couldn't stop, knew that the full release hadn't helped the president's case. Trump's name appeared constantly, over 1,000 references across the documents Holloway and his staff had reviewed, not all of them damaging, not all of them suggesting wrongdoing, but enough of them painting a picture of a relationship that had clearly been closer and lasted longer than Trump had ever acknowledged. There were emails about photos. "Would you like photos of Donald and girls in bikinis in my kitchen?" sent to journalists who might be interested. There were references to Trump visiting Epstein's property, spending time with women whose ages weren't specified but could be guessed at. There were notes suggesting that Epstein believed he had leverage over Trump, that he saw their relationship as an asset that could be deployed if needed. And then there were the later emails from 2016 onward, where Epstein's tone shifted from friendly to bitter. After Trump won the presidency, Epstein had written to friends calling Trump the worst person he'd ever met, someone without a single decent cell in his body. Those emails suggested a falling out, a relationship that had soured, and they'd given Trump's defenders ammunition to argue that whatever had happened between them was ancient history and irrelevant to Trump's presidency. But Holloway wasn't interested in defending or attacking. He was interested in the truth. And the truth was that these documents raised questions that deserved answers, not because Trump was guilty of anything. Holloway didn't know that and wasn't going to assume it, but because transparency was supposed to be what separated democracies from dictatorships. Because powerful men shouldn't get to hide their connections to convicted sex offenders, just because releasing those connections would be politically inconvenient. Because the American people had a right to know what their government knew, and if Trump had nothing to hide, then he should welcome the scrutiny instead of fighting it for months. That's what Holloway had told himself Wednesday night, reading through documents until his eyes hurt and his coffee had gone cold. That's what he told his chief of staff Thursday morning when she'd asked if he regretted signing the discharge petition. That's what he'd been prepared to tell reporters when they inevitably asked why he sided against his own president on an issue that was tearing the Republican Party apart. Then Sunday night happened, and Trump reversed course so completely that Holloway wondered if he'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. The Truth Social post had come around 9 p.m., long enough after the evening news cycle that it wouldn't dominate Sunday shows, but early enough that Monday morning would be shaped entirely by the reversal. House Republicans should vote to release the Epstein files because we have nothing to hide, Trump had written, and he'd followed it up with attacks on Democrats, calling the whole thing a hoax perpetrated by radical left lunatics who were trying to distract from Republican accomplishments. But the key phrase was there, impossible to ignore. We have nothing to hide. By Monday morning, Trump had doubled down. Asked by reporters if he'd signed legislation compelling the Justice Department to release the files, he'd said yes without hesitation. Let the Senate look at it. Let anybody look at it, he told them, sounding almost eager. And then came the spin that made Holloway realize this wasn't a surrender, it was a reframing. It's really a Democrat problem, Trump had said. The Democrats were Epstein's friends, all of them. Just like that, the narrative shifted. Trump wasn't being forced to release files he'd spent months blocking. He was courageously calling for transparency about Democrat corruption. He wasn't changing his position because 20,000 pages had made his previous position untenable. He was doing what he'd always wanted to do, and anyone who suggested otherwise was falling for fake news and partisan attacks. Holloway sat in his kitchen, watching the morning shows replay Trump's comments, and felt something close to admiration for the sheer audacity of it. You couldn't call it a flip-flop if you denied you'd ever held the other position. You couldn't be accused of caving to pressure if you claimed you'd been pushing for this outcome all along. It was political jiu-jitsu, using the momentum of your opponents against them, and Holloway had to admit it was masterfully done, even as it made him feel vaguely sick. His phone rang, an unlisted number that he almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of him, and he picked up on the fourth ring. Congressman Holloway, the voice was familiar, someone from the White House press office whose name he couldn't quite place. The president wanted me to reach out personally to thank you for your leadership on the Epstein files issue. He's always believed in transparency, and he's glad to have Republicans like you pushing for the truth. Holloway closed his eyes and counted to 3. I appreciate the call, he said carefully, but my position hasn't changed because the president's position apparently has. I signed that discharge petition because it was the right thing to do, not because anyone asked me to or thanked me for it. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that meant someone was recalibrating their script. Of course, Congressman, the president just wanted you to know he supports what you're doing. The call ended, and Holloway sat staring at his phone, trying to figure out what had just happened. His daughter came downstairs, backpack slung over one shoulder, earbuds already in. She pulled one out when she saw him sitting there. You okay, Dad? Holloway looked at her, 16 years old, smart enough to see through most of his political deflections, idealistic enough to still believe that doing the right thing mattered. He thought about telling her the truth, that he'd spent months fighting for something, and now the person he'd been fighting against was pretending they'd been on the same side all along, and he didn't know whether to feel vindicated or manipulated. Instead, he smiled and said, "Yeah, sweetheart, just work stuff." She nodded and headed for the door, and Holloway wondered what kind of world he was leaving her, where truth was whatever served you in the moment, and consistency was a weakness instead of a virtue. The week moved forward with the momentum of something that had already been decided, even though nobody was quite sure what had been decided. Tuesday, Massey and Green announced they'd be hosting Epstein survivors at the Capitol, giving the women who'd been victimized a platform to speak directly to lawmakers before the vote. Wednesday, the House Rules Committee scheduled time to consider the bill, and rumors started circulating that it would pass easily now that Trump had given his blessing. Thursday, someone leaked that Senate Republicans were privately furious at Trump for reversing course without consulting them, that they'd spent months defending his position and now looked like fools for having done so. Through all of it, Holloway kept his head down and did his job. He met with constituents, attended committee hearings, cast votes on minor bills that would never make headlines but mattered to the people they affected, and he tried not to think too hard about what it meant that he'd been right for the wrong reasons, or that winning felt exactly like losing when the person you've been fighting decided to join your side and claim credit for the victory. Friday afternoon, he got a call from a reporter asking for comment on Trump's reversal. "Do you feel vindicated?" the reporter asked, and Holloway almost laughed. "I feel like I did what I thought was right," he said, "and I'm glad we're going to get the transparency the American people deserve." It was a nothing answer, carefully crafted to offend nobody and mean nothing, and Holloway hated himself a little bit for giving it. But what was the alternative? Tell the truth? Say that he felt used and confused and uncertain about whether anything he'd done had mattered? That wouldn't help anybody. That night, he sat in his living room with his wife, watching the news coverage of the upcoming vote, and she asked him the question he'd been avoiding asking himself: was it worth it? She meant the endorsement he'd lost, the primary challenge he'd probably face, the relationships with colleagues that had been damaged maybe permanently. She meant the last 2 months of fighting a fight he thought would destroy his career, only to have that fight become irrelevant when the person he'd been fighting decided to switch sides. Holloway thought about Adelita Grijalva, who'd waited 7 weeks to take an oath she'd earned in September. He thought about the survivors who'd be speaking to Congress next week, women who'd been used and discarded by powerful men and then ignored by a system that should have protected them. He thought about his daughter, who'd grow up in a world shaped by decisions he and his colleagues made today. And he thought about the fact that sometimes doing the right thing didn't feel triumphant or vindicating. It just felt exhausting and complicated and uncertain. "Yeah," he said finally. It was worth it. He wasn't entirely sure he believed that, but he knew it was what he needed to believe to keep showing up, to keep doing the work, to keep trying even when trying felt pointless. His wife squeezed his hand, and they sat in silence, watching pundits debate what Trump's reversal meant and what it said about the state of the Republican Party and whether any of this would matter by the next election cycle. The vote was scheduled for Wednesday, exactly 1 week after the documents had dropped and blown up the careful narrative everyone had been maintaining. Holloway would vote yes, because he had always been going to vote yes, because his position had never been about Trump or politics or party loyalty. It had been about the principle that powerful people shouldn't get to hide their secrets just because those secrets were inconvenient. And if Trump wanted to claim he'd been on board with that principle all along, if he wanted to rewrite the history of the last few months and pretend he'd been fighting for transparency instead of against it, Holloway wasn't going to waste energy calling him out on it. because the truth was that it didn't matter. The files would be released, or at least whatever files the Justice Department decided were safe to release without compromising ongoing investigations or exposing victims who deserve privacy. The American people would get some answers, even if those answers raised more questions. And the next scandal would come along soon enough, the next crisis that would consume the news cycle and make everyone forget about this one until it became relevant again. And that's how Washington worked. You fought battles you couldn't win until suddenly you won them for reasons that had nothing to do with your fighting. You held the line on principle until the line moved and your principle became convenient for people who'd opposed it yesterday. You did the right thing and watched other people take credit for it, and you learned to find satisfaction in the doing instead of the recognition, because recognition was fleeting and unreliable and political. On Tuesday morning, Holloway walked into the Capitol and saw Massey and Green setting up for the Survivor event. He stopped to shake their hands, to thank them for their leadership on the issue, to acknowledge that they'd paid costs for this fight just like he had. Massey looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from months of being attacked by people who should have been allies. Think it'll matter? He asked Holloway, gesturing toward the room where survivors would soon be speaking. The vote's basically guaranteed now that Trump's on board, but will anyone actually care about what's in those files once they're public? Holloway didn't have a good answer for that. He wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that transparency mattered and truth would triumph and the system still worked if you push hard enough. But he'd been in politics long enough to know that attention spans were short and outrage was performative, and most people would read the headlines without diving into the details. The files would come out. Some would be damning, some would be exculpatory, most would be ambiguous, open to interpretation, fuel for whatever narrative you wanted to believe. It matters because we made it matter, Holloway said finally. It matters because we didn't let them bury it. Massey nodded slowly, and Holloway could see him trying to decide whether to believe that. Green joined them, and the three of them stood there for a moment, an unlikely alliance held together by the shared experience of being called traitors for asking questions powerful people didn't want to answer. The president called me yesterday, Green said quietly. Wanted to thank me for my leadership. Didn't mention the part where he spent months trying to get me to remove my name from the petition. She laughed, sharp and bitter. Guess we're all heroes now that it's convenient. Holloway and Massey didn't respond because what was there to say? They'd all lived through the same experience, felt the same pressure, made the same choice to hold firm. And now that choice was being reframed as loyalty instead of rebellion, and they were supposed to smile and accept the revision and pretend the last few months hadn't happened. The survivors started arriving around 10 women of various ages who had agreed to speak publicly about what Epstein had done to them. Holloway watched them file into the room, saw the determination in their faces, mixed with something that looked like resignation, and he understood they'd been telling their stories for years to prosecutors, to journalists, to anyone who'd listen, and for years they'd watched powerful men face minimal consequences while they carried the weight of what had been done to them. Now Congress was finally paying attention, finally forcing the issue, and they probably didn't believe it would matter, but they were showing up anyway because what else could you do? One of the women, Holloway didn't catch her name, spoke about being recruited at 16, about spending years trapped in a system that used her and then discarded her when she got too old. She spoke about seeing men she recognized from television and magazines, about understanding even then that these were people who would never face consequences because power protected power. And she spoke about watching politicians promise accountability while delivering excuses, about learning not to trust anyone who said they cared because caring was cheap and action was expensive. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Massey stood and thanked her for her courage, and Green echoed him, and Holloway felt something crack open in his chest, because this was why it mattered, not because of Trump or politics or party advantage, because of women like this one, who'd been failed by every system that should have protected them, and who deserved better than another round of promises that wouldn't be kept. Wednesday came too fast and too slow, the way important days always do. Holloway walked onto the House floor knowing exactly how he'd vote, but uncertain what that vote would actually accomplish. The bill would pass, that was guaranteed now that Trump had given his blessing and Republicans had cover to support it. The Justice Department would be compelled to release whatever files they deemed releasable. Some truths would come out, some would stay buried, and life would go on, basically unchanged, because that's what always happened. The debate was shorter than expected. Members mostly echoing points that had been made 100 times already. Democrats praised the bill as overdue accountability. Republicans praised it as courageous transparency. A few members from both parties spoke against it, warning about privacy concerns and the danger of releasing information that could compromise ongoing investigations. but the outcome was never in doubt, and when the vote was called, Holloway pressed the green button without hesitation. The final tally was 274 to 161, a solid majority, bipartisan support, exactly what you'd expect for a bill that had been controversial right up until it wasn't. The president would sign it, he'd already said so publicly, and within weeks or months, the Justice Department would start releasing documents. Reporters would comb through them looking for bombshells. Conspiracy theorists would find patterns in the chaos. Survivors would watch powerful people get away with things again because that's what powerful people did. Holloway left the Capitol that evening feeling neither victorious nor defeated, just tired. His phone was full of messages, some congratulating him, some condemning him, most just confused about what had happened and what it meant. He ignored them all and drove home, where his daughter was doing homework at the kitchen table and his wife was making dinner like it was any other Wednesday. How'd it go? His wife asked, and Holloway shrugged. It passed. We'll see what happens next. That was the honest answer. The only answer he had. They'd forced transparency, but transparency didn't guarantee justice. They'd asked questions, but questions didn't guarantee answers. They'd done something, but doing something didn't guarantee it would matter. His daughter looked up from her work. Are you going to be okay? She meant the primary challenge, the lost endorsement, the political cost of fighting a fight that had ended without clear resolution. Holloway smiled at her, genuine this time. Yeah, kiddo, I'm going to be fine. And he meant it, because fine didn't require vindication or recognition or even certainty that you'd made the right call. Fine just meant showing up tomorrow and doing the work again, even when the work felt pointless, because the alternative was giving up entirely. The Epstein files would come out eventually. Some would be explosive, some would be disappointing, most would be forgotten within a news cycle, buried under whatever crisis or scandal came next. Trump would claim credit for transparency he'd fought against for months. Democrats would claim they'd forced his hand. Republicans would claim they'd always supported accountability, and everyone would be right and everyone would be wrong because truth in Washington was whatever story you told and could get people to believe. But Holloway had his daughter's respect, which mattered more than the president's endorsement. He had his conscience, which was intact even if his political future wasn't. And he had the knowledge that when it mattered, when the pressure was highest and the cost was real, he'd chosen principle over convenience. That wouldn't be enough to save his seat if the primary challenge materialized. It wouldn't be enough to change a system that rewarded performance over substance, but it was enough to let him sleep at night, and in Washington that might be the best you could hope for. The next morning, new headlines appeared. The news cycle moved on. The Epstein story faded from the front pages, replaced by whatever fresh crisis demanded attention. And David Holloway went back to work, answering constituent calls and attending committee meetings and voting on bills that wouldn't make anyone's highlight reel. He'd fought for transparency and gotten it, sort of. He'd held the line and watched it move beneath his feet. He'd done what he thought was right, and discovered that right was complicated and unsatisfying and uncertain. But he'd done it anyway. And when his daughter asked him years from now about the Epstein vote, about the fight that nearly cost him his career, he'd be able to look her in the eye and say he'd chosen truth over power, even when truth didn't come with guarantees. That had to count for something. Maybe not enough, but something. And in the end, that might be all you get, the knowledge that you tried, that you showed up, that you didn't look away when looking away would have been easier. It wasn't much of a legacy, but it was honest. And honesty, Holloway was learning, was the rarest currency in Washington.